At precisely 2:17 a.m., the silence over the border city shattered. Headlights reflected off the slick asphalt. A lone pickup truck veered into a quiet residential street, and for one tremulous moment, Tijuana took a breath it would never exhale. In that instant, everything changed. The balloons of flame lit the neighborhood like a midnight sunrise. Windows shattered in apartment buildings, families bolted out of their doors, and footsteps raced through alleys that only hours earlier held nothing but the mundane hum of city life. But the blast wasn't the story. It was the warning, a message inked in gunpowder and blood. Welcome to the fault line. The border where two countries meet, and the place where empires of crime collided. In the shadows of the night, one criminal organization, the mighty Arellano-Félix organization, also known as the Tijuana Cartel, already controlled the arteries of drug, money, and fear flowing into the United States. Wikipedia +3 PBS +3 PBS +3. By 1989, the cartel was born from betrayal and ambition, rooted in a single family from Sinaloa who saw the border not as a boundary but as an opportunity. Wilson Center +1. They bribed, intimidated, smuggled millions of dollars in cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, but what they built was more than business. They built terror. In the words of U.S. and Mexican authorities, this cartel was undeniably the most violent. PBS +1. Yet, for a time, it worked. The city, Tijuana, seemed balanced between light and darkness, the pedestrian cafes just minutes from border crossings, the life of tourism and the smuggling corridors. Until the lid blew off. What you're about to hear is the full truth of how one reckless order created a war that turned a city into a battlefield, how the kingpins made mistakes, how the law turned from protector into puppet, and how ordinary men and women paid the highest price. You'll meet enforcers who smiled in daylight and carried AK-47s at dusk. You'll hear from families who woke to screams and never slept again. You'll follow the money, the routes, the hidden alliances, and you'll discover the name that looked untouchable until it wasn't. The battleground was the border. The weapon was terror. And the consequence? A generation of fear. So stay with me, because by the time the sun rises over Tijuana's smoldering streets, you'll understand why this war wasn't fought for turf. It was fought for control and for silence. Right after this title sequence, we'll travel back to the quiet streets of a city nobody expected to explode, and trace the moment when the cartels declared war. This is the bloody battle for Tijuana.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
In the faint glow of streetlights, the city of Tijuana sits astride two worlds, one foot in the bustling commerce of the United States, the other in the raw, restless heart of Mexico. A border city, yes, but also a crossroads, of ambition, migration, opportunity, and danger. For decades, Tijuana moved quietly along its tightrope. Tourists ducked across the border for a night of music and tacos. Trucks rumbled through its gates, carrying goods both legal and illicit. Families rose each morning to the hum of traffic and the promise of something better. But beneath that hum lay a tension. The asphalt held secrets. The checkpoints were watched. The corridors of commerce were also corridors of smuggling. And the men who walked those corridors understood something others did not. Control of this city was not just about streets, it was about power. In the 1980s and early 1990s, one organization slipped into that power vacuum and began to stake its claim. Known as the Arellano-Félix organization, also called the Tijuana Cartel, it would become one of the most ruthless players on the entire drug trafficking map. PBS+2 Wikipedia+2. The cartel traced its roots to the state of Sinaloa, to a mentor known in the business as El Padrino. From there, the Arellano-Félix brothers, nephews of that mentor, began to build a network that stretched from the factories and tunnels of Baja California to the SUVs of Southern California. Wilson Center +1. In one sense, their rise was inevitable. Tijuana was ideally placed, miles of border, thousands of crossings every day, porous ground and political underbrush. The city's geography invited smuggling, and the system of bribery and corruption provided the cover. According to investigators, the cartel dispensed around $1 million per week in bribes alone. PBS+1. Walk through Tijuana today and you'll see the clutter of everyday life, border inspection booths, buzzing taxis, cafes on Revolution Avenue, families crossing at dawn. But the same streets carry the memory of armored SUVs, masked men, burned-out cars, the sudden silence after a midnight gunfight. In the words of those who study the region, when one sees vehicles set ablaze and blocks sealed by gunmen, normalcy didn't return until days later. KPBS Public Media. Yet, at first, the change was subtle. The city did not wake one morning as a war zone. It woke with uncertainty. The cartels outside the limelight were busy, shifting alliances, quietly recruiting young men in neighborhoods, bribing officers in back rooms, building that most dangerous of things, infrastructure. Tunnels under the border. Secret labs. Safe houses. Money laundering businesses tucked into plain sight. And the local officials? Some cooperated because they were threatened. Some because they were paid. And some because they believed they could ride the wave of power and walk away unscathed. That belief was wrong. Because the moment you think you're untouchable, someone starts counting your shots and your bodies. For the residents of Tijuana, the taxi drivers, the store clerks, the mothers tucking their children into bed, this meant waking up to questions they never asked before. Why was the traffic stopped this morning at 5? Who is that man standing outside our door? Why is the border crossing backed up for hours? As the city's daytime bustle went on, at night an entirely different economy pulsed. From the dead of one alley, the flicker of headlights, then footsteps. Weapons exchanged. Contracts honored or broken. Lives extinguished. In one neighborhood, it was the quiet hum of a child's radio followed by a shutter slamming shut. In another, the sudden roar of a convoy cutting through the midnight air. And then the silence, as though the city dared not breathe until the danger passed. By the mid-1990s, analysts were calling the Arellano-Félix organization undeniably the most violent among the border zone traffickers. PBS+1 Their paramilitary squads, according to U.S. and Mexican authorities, included recruits from U.S. gangs, and they operated with astonishing boldness. PBS. But even the most ruthless organizations need infrastructure, routes, logistics, money, corruption. Tijuana offered those in spades. The city's proximity to San Diego meant access to U.S. markets, its neighborhoods offered hidden corners, its officials were vulnerable, its public narrative was still one of tourism, not terror, which made the dark business easier to camouflage. So for a while, the balance held, the wheels turned. Tijuana thrived superficially, the streets filled, the nightlife vibrated, but under that veneer, something else spun. And then the pressure started to build. Corridor after corridor. Rival factions pushed in. Enforcement crackdowns carved new opportunities. Bribes became costlier. Loyalty became fickle. And as that pressure built, Tijuana became less of a city on the edge and more of a cradle for conflict. Before the war declared itself. Before the bullets split the night. Because when the cartels declared war, they picked the city. Later in the story, we'll go back to one fateful night, the night when the first major strike was delivered, the moment when the veneer broke, and the war didn't start with a declaration. It started with a single target, a single life, and a decision. But first, we need to meet the rulers of that underworld, and understand who thought they were safe. In the quiet dawn of a desert border city, power seldom announces itself. It arrives in whispers, sealed briefcases, a nod across a cocktail table, the hum of an engine in a dark alley. In Arellano-Félix organization's case, it arrived in the form of a family. A family that would come to rule Tijuana's shadows with a mix of violence and calculation that few could match, and even fewer would survive. If you picture the border between the United States and Mexico, think of it not only as a line on a map, but as a front row seat to the greatest game of chess in the drug world. One side, legitimate traffic, cross-border commuters, duty-free shops, tourists chasing margaritas at midnight. The other side, transport trucks with false bottoms, tunnels that run beneath city streets, men with names nobody wants to say aloud. The Arellano-Félix enterprise occupied both worlds. It began in Sinaloa, yes, but it found its kingdom in Baja California. 7 brothers, 4 sisters, siblings bonded by blood, ambition, and an inheritance of crime. Benjamin Arellano-Félix was the strongman at the helm, codename El Señor. He claimed leadership after their uncle's arrest and set the tone, ruthlessness with infrastructure. Then there was Ramon Arellano-Félix, known to many simply as the Enforcer. He rode motorcycles, carried heavy weapons, made people fear the nights. His signature, swift violence, and a chilling message to anyone who crossed the line. But the game was never just about bullets. It was about territory, supply chains, and who could move the biggest load across the busiest border in the world. Beneath them, other brothers, Eduardo Arellano-Félix, Javier Arellano-Félix, took control of logistics, finance, and networks. Their sister, Enedina Arellano-Félix, yes, a woman in a cartel world dominated by men, managed money laundering, front companies, and alliances behind the scenes. They made their move when the old guard faltered. After Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo was arrested and the Guadalajara corridor splintered, the Arellano-Félix clan stepped in. In 1989, they took the mantle and made Tijuana not just a waypoint, but a fortress. Their empire was breathtaking. The border crossing at San Isidro. Trucks, trains, tunnels, moving cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, heroin, ton after ton. The U.S. authorities estimated that they handled multi-ton shipments from Colombia, through sea and air, into the United States. But power built on smuggling needs more than routes, it needs protection. Sometimes that protection came in the form of corruption, police officers, customs agents, local officials. Sometimes it came in fear, bodies left in the street, gang members recruited across the border in San Diego, enforcement squads trained to kill. The brothers' world comprised neon-lit clubs, luxury cars, and mansions, yes, but also secret bunkers, assassinations, and the kind of violence rarely spoken of in polite company. They blurred the lines between legal business and drug empire, between border city and battleground. In the early 1990s, the Arellano-Félix organization emerged as a dominant force. Their rivals looked at them and asked, how do they move so much? And how do they make so many vanish without the world seeing? The answer, they built from inside. They used family ties, long-standing loyalty, and institutional corruption. They used the American market's hunger. They used the border's weaknesses. Inside the cartel, loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. Anyone who doubted the family's power heard through the grapevine what happened when someone refused an order: bodies dissolved in drums, disappearances at night, a funeral no one attended. Their reputation for violence became itself a tool of control. U.S. officials once described them as undeniably the most violent criminal organization in this part of the world. One important chapter: in March 2002, Benjamin was arrested in Mexico. He had led the cartel from roughly 1986 until that moment, and his departure signaled a crack. FBI archives +1 shortly after, in February 2002, Ramon was killed in a shootout with Mexican authorities. These blows were seismic. The kingpins who made their city quake were suddenly vulnerable. But that vulnerability would only shift the conflict, rather than end it. It is one thing to lead a cartel when you're on top. It is another thing entirely to lead it when the world is pushing back. The power vacuum didn't restore peace. It invited war. Other criminal groups saw the opening: their rivalries, their resentment, their ambition, and Tijuana, once controlled, became contested. Meanwhile, the everyday residents felt none of this planning. They woke to normal routines, unaware that their streets were about to change. Nightclubs still played, tacos still sizzled, family noise still echoed. But beneath the surface, more trucks carried more product, more cash switched hands in daylight, and more gunmen gathered in parking garages. The unsuspecting city was shifting under its feet. And so the stage was set. A family empire that believed it could dominate. Rivals who believed they could strike back. A city that believed it could remain untouched. Each of them wrong. Because when the gears of war shift, it's not only the traffickers who pay, it's everyone around them. In the next chapter, we will witness the first shots fired, the moment the war truly began. We'll follow the ambush that ripped apart the quiet night, the neighborhoods that woke to panic, and the order that collapsed into open chaos. But for now, remember this: the kings of Tijuana don crowns made of fear, and when a crown cracks, the world below it fractures. On a night that seemed ordinary, the air over the city of Tijuana carried a different kind of quiet. A hush that wasn't peace. It was the calm that falls just before something breaks. The city's lights blinked at their usual rhythm. The border crossing hummed. Families slept. Taxi drivers idled at their stands. But just beneath that pattern, the wheels of a war machine were already turning. The stage had been set in the preceding years: the infrastructure, the money, the guns. The men who held power believed they had the city sewn up. The streets, the checkpoints, the tunnels beneath the asphalt, they'd all been accounted for. Yet what no one foresaw was how quickly the order would unravel. It happened with a target. Not a full-scale battle. Not an announcement. Just a single strike. The kind of strike that carries more meaning because it happens quietly, in a moment when people aren't looking. Reports later reconstructed how a small convoy rolled into the dead of night. Guns out. One house. A body. The next morning, neighbors awoke not to bird calls, but to the smell of burned rubber and the sight of broken glass. Panic raced through the district like a virus. And in that panic, control lost its illusion. You see, war in Tijuana didn't begin with drums or banners. It began when the quiet stopped being trusted. When a checkpoint no longer meant safety. When a roadblock suddenly meant danger. In the following weeks, the city became a chessboard of movement. Convoys that should have taken 1 hour took 3. Safe houses emptied. Families relocated. Hired guns from across the border poured in. And the main players, the once confident kings, realized that someone was hitting them where they thought themselves untouchable: home territory. One front was the highways linking Tijuana to the United States. That corridor, so long a lifeline for the cartel, became contested. You'll recall how in Chapter 2 we saw the strength of the Arellano-Félix organization, its network of routes, its bribes, its paramilitary squads. But they were built for the old order. The coming conflict would test whether those tools were still enough. On one occasion, investigators later discovered an abandoned load of methamphetamine along a desert road north of Tijuana. The shipment was meant for San Diego. But someone had intercepted it. Or perhaps someone let it happen. The message was clear: we can reach you. Meanwhile, across neighborhoods where workers, taxi drivers, and students lived, something changed. At 10 p.m. the night was lighter. Masked men moved like ghosts under streetlights. Curfews were quietly imposed. Doors slammed shut earlier. Windows shuttered. Families paused their routines because the routines were no longer safe. The local police, once lazy in the afternoons, became nervous. They shifted their patrols. Satellite cameras were deployed. But even then, the quiet before the storm lingered until the storm hit. One of the deadliest days arrived when gunmen blocked a residential street, forced residents into their homes, and then opened fire on a rival cell using automatic weapons. The sound of the burst rifles echoed in the hills. Inside homes, children cried. Cars exploded. Firefighters arrived to see doors ajar, bodies on the curb, and no bulletproof vest in sight. Journalists struggled to keep up. They arrived too late. Their cameras caught the aftermath. The live feed showed lights flashing, ambulances, and terrified residents. But in those scenes, one thing stood out: the absence of authority. The authority that once guarded them had taken cover. And that is how the war shifted from the shadows into the open. In the midst of all this, the rival forces tasted what victory felt like, but they also smelled what desperation did. Territory changed hands overnight. Tunnels were abandoned. Safe houses became death traps. Former allies turned their guns inward. By the end of the first full month of open conflict, homicide rates in Tijuana surged. Longtime residents said they'd never seen anything like it. The numbers made headlines: missing persons, mass graves, firefights in daylight. According to local analysts, the once steady pulse of the city became erratic. KPBS Public Media. But it wasn't just about bodies and turf. It was about the message. One cell sent a video of masked men walking into a checkpoint, replacing the officer with one of their own, and filming the exchange like a commercial. Another posted burned-out police cars with a note: "Your time is over." And the legitimate world paid a price. Border crossings were clogged. Teams of U.S. agents stood on the San Isidro side wondering how a city so close could slip so far. Business owners shuttered late-night operations. Families canceled plans. The rumor mill replaced the adverts for nightlife. For the kings who believed their thrones secure, the message was humbling. One senior figure later said, off record, "We thought we were untouchable. We thought Tijuana was ours." Then the night turned. And so, as the war spread, the city began to feel unfamiliar. Street lights no longer meant safety. Intersection traffic no longer meant routine. Each car had to be watched, each pedestrian questioned, each silence considered suspect. The authorities responded, eventually. The Mexican army rolled in. Special forces units were deployed under an operation called Operation Baja California. Wikipedia +1. But armies do not win wars built on tunnels, bribes, and corruption alone. And the cartel forces adapted. They moved into smaller cells, switched to night raids, shifted from bullets to disappearances. In the viewer's mind now you should picture Tijuana transformed from a neon border town to an unsteady battlefield. Not overnight, but inexorably. The war slipped into daily life. Alarm clocks, school buses, family dinners all became backdrops for something darker. Yet, even in that darkness, a spark of human resistance remained. Taxi drivers who refused to work late. Shopkeepers who hid clients until the gunman passed. Mothers who barricaded windows. The civilians did not choose the war, but they had to live it. If you imagine a single moment where the war began, you'll find there was no singular Big Bang. More accurate is to say the war declared itself when a taxi driver refused a fare from masked men, when a smuggler's route was cut, when the radio of a gang unit picked up the chatter, "Tonight we move." Then windows shut. Then gunfire. And by the time the sun rose on the city's battered streets, the quiet night that had once blanketed the border was gone. Replaced by something else: anticipation. Fear. The knowledge that the next knock on the door could be the worst one. In the next chapter, we will dive into the betrayal that followed, how allies turned into enemies, how the cartel's internal cracks grew wider than the bullets they fired, how the war inside outgrew the war outside. We'll follow the voices inside the cartel who spoke for themselves, the informants in prison, the officers who turned on their masters, and the families who watched their world vanish. Because the war that began in the streets was only the beginning. The real battle was just starting. In war, the first casualty is trust. And in Tijuana, trust didn't die quietly. It was executed, in cold blood. By the time 2008 rolled in, the lines between friend and foe had blurred beyond recognition. The cartels were no longer fighting just the police or the military, they were fighting each other. The real war was now inside the organizations that once ruled the border with iron confidence. You could feel it everywhere, in the whispered phone calls, in the sudden silences at cartel meetings, in the half-empty safe houses. A tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. At the heart of it all were two names: Fernando Sanchez Arellano, known as El Ingeniero, and Teodoro Garcia Cimental, El Teo. Both had been loyal to the same empire, the legendary Arellano-Félix organization. But loyalty, in the world of Narcos, has an expiration date. El Ingeniero was the calculating one, disciplined, quiet, a man of old rules. He wanted control through structure, fear, and silent dominance. El Teo? He was chaos. Pure violence. He didn't believe in order, he believed in fire. For years, they coexisted under the same flag, running the same streets, moving the same shipments. But when power shifted and profits began to shrink, greed started whispering in both men's ears. The first sign came when one of El Ingeniero's trusted lieutenants went missing, last seen leaving a nightclub in Playas de Tijuana. 2 days later, his body was found hanging from a bridge, wrapped in a plastic tarp, a note pinned to his chest. The note read, "For the rats who forget who feeds them." It wasn't signed. But everyone knew whose handwriting it was. The message wasn't just for the victim, it was for everyone watching. It was El Teo's way of saying, "The streets are mine now." And just like that, a line was drawn through the heart of the city. The Arellano-Félix organization, once united under a single command, split into two warring factions, one loyal to El Ingeniero, the other to El Teo. Brothers turned into rivals. Soldiers became executioners. The betrayal hit like a thunderclap. Whole neighborhoods became fronts. Tijuana was no longer a single city, it was two kingdoms divided by blood and paranoia. People began disappearing by the dozens. Some were found in the canyons that cut through the city's outskirts. Others were never found at all. The violence that followed was unlike anything the city had seen before. Bodies dumped on highways. Heads left on car hoods with cardboard signs warning, "This is what happens when you switch sides." And beneath all that brutality lay the same question echoing through the cartel world: who could you still trust? For the first time in decades, the Arellano Empire was crumbling from the inside. Its leaders were no longer fighting for power, they were fighting to survive their own soldiers. Witnesses later described secret meetings in dimly lit warehouses, where old lieutenants argued in whispers while their bodyguards watched each other with fingers on triggers. One witness said, "Nobody slept. Nobody ate. Even your brother could be the one sent to kill you." Across the border, U.S. intelligence agents watched the chaos unfold with disbelief. From their surveillance feeds, they could see the shifting alliances. One night El Teo's men would escort a convoy, the next night they'd ambush it. For civilians, Tijuana became a maze of invisible front lines. People learned to recognize the sound of different rifles. AK-47s meant El Teo's crew. AR-15s meant El Ingenieros. Even the police didn't know which side they were on anymore. Some took bribes from both. Others disappeared trying to stay neutral. The violence escalated beyond the city's control. In 2008 alone, over 840 homicides were recorded, most of them linked to the internal cartel war. Journalists called it La Guerra Interna, the internal war. Los Angeles Times, 2009. The war consumed everyone, from drug mules to mayors. What began as a feud between two men soon dragged the entire structure into an abyss. Both sides adopted scorched earth tactics. Houses torched. Families murdered for being related to the wrong name. Police informants buried alive. The city was on fire. And as the smoke rose, something unexpected began to happen. Smaller gangs, long crushed by the Arellano family's dominance, saw opportunity. They emerged from the shadows, ready to take pieces of the empire for themselves. What had once been a single organization now fractured into dozens of smaller, uncontrolled war bands. Violence was no longer about territory, it became personal. In one of the most chilling moments of the conflict, El Teo's men kidnapped one of El Ingeniero's nephews and filmed his execution. The video leaked online, a grotesque display meant to show that blood ties no longer mattered. The message was clear: family doesn't protect you here. And yet, through all the horror, there was a kind of twisted respect between the factions, a recognition that both sides were born of the same streets, molded by the same empire. Tijuana citizens began calling them Los Hermanos del Infierno, the Brothers of Hell. Each night, the city trembled under the sound of gunfire. The sky flashed orange as cars exploded on deserted streets. The newspapers stopped printing names. Reporters started vanishing. Even funerals became dangerous. And amidst all of it, one name began to resurface, whispered in the corners, rumored in police reports. Sinaloa. As the Arellano-Félix organization devoured itself, the rival Sinaloa Cartel, led by none other than Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was quietly watching. Waiting. They didn't need to invade Tijuana with tanks or armies. They only needed to let the brothers destroy themselves, and when the dust settled, they would step into the ruins. That's how wars end in the cartel world, not with peace, but with replacement. And as Chapter 4 closes, one truth becomes painfully clear. The city was not yet done bleeding. Because while the war within the Arellanos was tearing Tijuana apart, another, far greater predator was already moving toward the border. When two brothers fight, the stranger inherits the house. By the end of 2008, Tijuana was no longer the empire it once was. The Arellano-Félix organization, once feared across the continent, was broken, bled dry by its own hands. The streets that once echoed with its name now whispered another. Sinaloa. To the rest of Mexico, it was a shadow that stretched from the Pacific coast to the mountains of Durango. To the world, it was a legend, the empire of El Chapo Guzman. But to Tijuana, Sinaloa was a promise and a threat wrapped in one name. The promise of money. The threat of control. You see, while El Ingeniero and El Teo were destroying each other, the Sinaloa Cartel had been quietly studying every weakness, every broken route, every nervous contact, every crooked cop waiting for a higher bidder. They didn't send an army. They didn't need to. They sent men with briefcases, then men with rifles, then men who smiled while making deals by day and burning warehouses by night. It began with whispers in the hills of Baja California, reports of unfamiliar convoys, trucks without plates, and men speaking in accents that weren't local. The soldiers of Sinaloa had crossed into Tijuana territory. At first, no one believed it. How could they? The Arellanos had ruled these streets for over a decade, their name was built into the asphalt. But as the killings grew more precise, more strategic, the truth became undeniable. El Chapo Guzman had come for Tijuana. For years, the Sinaloa Cartel had wanted access to the San Isidro border, the Golden Gate into the United States, the busiest land crossing in the world. Whoever controlled it didn't just control Tijuana, they controlled billions in drug revenue. And now, with the city weakened and its leaders divided, it was ripe for the taking. The invasion didn't come with fanfare. It came with silence, the kind that only hits after a city has already lost its heartbeat. One morning, police found 5 men hanging from an overpass, their bodies naked, their skin carved with a single letter. S. The message wasn't poetic, it was surgical. It said, "We're here now." The locals started calling it La Toma, the taking. But what made Sinaloa's rise different wasn't just their brutality, it was their precision. They didn't want chaos, they wanted control. They didn't kill for headlines, they killed for silence. They began bribing what was left of the local police. They reactivated old smuggling tunnels under the border, the same tunnels once built by the Arellanos, now turned against them. U.S. authorities would later uncover dozens of these underground passages stretching from suburban warehouses in Tijuana to unsuspecting parking lots in San Diego. One of those tunnels, over 500 yards long, had electricity, ventilation, even a small rail cart system. When investigators found it, it was empty. Only fresh footprints remained. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, 2010. El Chapo didn't need to shout. His methods whispered. Meanwhile, Tijuana civilians lived in a surreal limbo. On some nights, the gunfire stopped completely, eerie silence returning after months of bloodshed. On others, the explosions came back without warning, ripping through the city blocks where families had begun to rebuild. A journalist later said, "In Tijuana, peace always feels borrowed." By 2009, El Teo's war with El Ingeniero had weakened both sides so badly that Sinaloa could walk through the ruins. One by one, corrupted lieutenants switched allegiance. El Teo himself, desperate and isolated, reportedly sought protection from Sinaloa factions. But El Chapo Guzman never trusted desperation. He used it, then buried it. The killings continued, but their pattern changed. No longer random, now targeted. Former Arellano-Félix loyalists were hunted with surgical precision. In broad daylight, in markets, outside schools. Locals called it La Caceria, the hunt. It wasn't about punishing traitors anymore, it was about cleansing the city of anyone who could claim it before Sinaloa did. By the middle of that year, the balance had shifted. Federal forces stationed in Baja California noticed something uncanny. The firefights were fewer, but the control checkpoints were now manned by men in civilian clothes, carrying identical radios. They weren't soldiers. They weren't police. They were Sinaloa's men, already embedded. Behind the scenes, government officials, some knowingly, some unknowingly, facilitated the transition. Corruption wasn't a side effect, it was a strategy. Documents leaked years later suggested that certain federal officers had been reassigned to help maintain order in Tijuana, but in reality, they were ensuring Sinaloa's smooth handover. Reuters, 2011. And El Chapo's message was simple. We don't need to win every battle. We just need to own the peace. That peace came, but it was a graveyard silence. The war that had once painted the city in flames now left behind only ashes and whispers. Murders dropped, but only because there was no one left to fight. In 2010, Mexican authorities captured El Teo in La Paz, Baja California, sir. He had been hiding in a luxury home with his girlfriend and 4 bodyguards, reportedly betrayed by one of his own men. The government displayed his capture as a triumph. The newspapers showed him in handcuffs, disheveled but smiling, the smile of a man who knew the game had ended long before that day. BBC News, 2010. But what they didn't understand was that El Teo's arrest didn't end the war. It simply handed the keys to the next owner. With El Teo gone, El Ingeniero in hiding, and the Arellano name fading into legend, the Sinaloa Cartel moved in fully. They restored trade routes, rebuilt alliances, reopened the channels to San Diego. The city looked calm again. The tourists began to return. The headlines softened. But to those who had lived through it, the peace felt strange, like waking from a nightmare only to realize the dream was still watching you. A survivor later said, Tijuana stopped screaming. But you could still hear her breathing, like someone afraid to move. And in that fragile silence, one truth settled like dust on bloodstained streets. Wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when everyone forgets who started them. But history doesn't forget. Because every war leaves its ghosts, in the faces of children who grew up hearing gunfire instead of lullabies, in the mothers who still set extra plates at dinner tables that no one fills, in the soldiers who learned that peace is just another kind of battlefield. The invasion was complete. Sinaloa had won. But at what cost? And as one empire rose from another's ashes, a new threat began to whisper its way north, a younger generation, more reckless, more bloodthirsty, more digital. When an empire falls, it doesn't vanish. It seeps into the cracks, waiting for something new to grow from the ruins. After the invasion of Sinaloa, Tijuana felt quieter. Too quiet. The bodies stopped appearing on bridges. The gunfire became rare. The soldiers patrolling the streets looked bored again. But under that uneasy calm, something was moving, something young, fast, and hungry. The newspapers called them La Nueva Sangre, the new blood. They weren't born in the boardrooms of cartel bosses. They were born in the streets. In neighborhoods that had seen too much blood, too much loss, and not enough future. Kids who'd grown up watching the cartels as their country's only symbol of power, the only system that seemed to work when everything else didn't. In this new generation, they didn't want to inherit the old rules. They wanted to rewrite them. They had no patience for hierarchy. No respect for tradition. They didn't bow to old names like Arellano or Guzman. To them, those men were history, legends, yes, but from a different time. The new blood were born with smartphones, not radios. Their warfare wasn't just in alleys, it was online. They filmed their raids. They posted their victories. They built fear through visibility, not secrecy. What the old cartels built in decades, they built in months. And unlike their predecessors, they didn't hide their identities, they flaunted them. On social media, videos began surfacing, masked men in tactical vests, holding gold-plated rifles, shouting the initials CJNG into cameras. The Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generation, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. They were rising fast. Founded by a former enforcer known as Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, or El Mencho, CJNG was everything the old cartels feared: organized, ruthless, technologically fluent, and utterly indifferent to the codes of the past. While Sinaloa prided itself on discretion, CJNG prided itself on spectacle. And for a while, the two worlds coexisted, one old, one new. But peace between wolves never lasts. In 2012, whispers began spreading through Tijuana's streets again: unexplained kidnappings, armed convoys rolling through the outskirts, civilians vanishing after dark. Then, one morning, the city awoke to a sight it hadn't seen in years. Banners. Hung from overpasses, printed in black and red, signed with 3 letters that would soon haunt the nation. CJNG. The messages were clear and brutal. We are here to clean Tijuana. The city belongs to Jalisco now. The old ghosts of the Arellano-Félix empire shuddered in their graves. Because everyone knew what cleaning meant. It wasn't a promise. It was a threat. The new blood didn't just want territory, they wanted reputation. They wanted headlines. They wanted every rival, every reporter, every citizen to know that there was a new name in charge. And they didn't move in silence like the old cartels, they moved like a show. Convoys of trucks with tinted windows, armed men waving military-grade rifles, blasting music from modified speakers. Their message was theatrical and terrifying. They filmed entire raids and uploaded them online, police ambushes, executions, even propaganda speeches. Their brutality wasn't just a tool, it was a brand. Analysts later described it as narco-marketing. Incite crime, 2020. And like any brand, it worked. Within a year, CJNG had spread from Jalisco to Baja California, infiltrating Tijuana through the same routes Sinaloa once controlled. They paid off young police officers, seduced small-time dealers, and recruited from a new generation that had grown up watching the chaos of the 2000s. For them, cartel life wasn't rebellion, it was survival. These new recruits weren't fighting for a family name or loyalty. They were fighting for visibility, for power, for likes on videos that showed them holding assault rifles and counting stacks of cash. It was a different kind of war now, one that blurred the line between crime and entertainment. While El Chapo's men operated in shadows, El Mencho's men broadcasted their brutality like it was a message to the world. We are not the future, we are the present. And Tijuana once again became a battlefield. But this time, the war didn't look the same. It wasn't about 2 empires clashing over turf. It was about dozens of splinter cells, each claiming allegiance to CJNG or Sinaloa, fighting over a city that had already bled too much. Civilians found themselves caught in invisible crossfire again: extortion, kidnappings, street executions. Old scars were reopening. The eerie calm that had followed the Sinaloa takeover dissolved. The city's murder rate began climbing again. By 2018, Tijuana became the most violent city in the world, with more than 2,500 homicides that year alone. Mexico News Daily, 2019. Once again, fear became routine. But what made this new era even more terrifying was how invisible it was. CJNG didn't just fight in the streets, they infiltrated institutions. Police forces. Political offices. Even parts of the army. Their money was everywhere. Their reach, unstoppable. And while the world watched El Chapo's high-profile arrest and dramatic escape in 2015, something even more sinister was growing in his shadow, a new system built not on secrecy, but on terror and digital propaganda. Sinaloa's fall didn't end Mexico's cartel wars, it evolved them. The new blood learned from the old guard's mistakes. They diversified their trades, not just cocaine or meth, but extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, oil theft, cybercrime. They didn't just build tunnels. They built networks. For the first time, Mexico's cartels were no longer just a criminal empire, they had become a parallel state. And Tijuana, the city that once symbolized the glory of the Arellano-Félix dynasty, was now a playground for competing monsters, old and new. Yet, amidst the smoke and chaos, one question kept echoing in the hearts of Tijuana's people. When does it end? But wars like these don't end. They only evolve. The faces change. The weapons change. The headlines change. But the graves stay the same. As one Tijuana journalist wrote in 2022, "We no longer cover a war. We live inside it." Border Report, 2022. The new blood had risen. And now, the world had to face a new kind of cartel, one that couldn't be negotiated with, one that didn't play by rules, one that didn't fear the camera because the camera was their weapon. In this war, the battlefield had no borders. There are cities that never sleep, and there are cities that never heal. Tijuana is both. When the gunfire faded and the smoke drifted out over the Pacific, it left behind a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like memory, heavy, unspoken, and everywhere. You can walk through Tijuana today and still feel it in the air, like ghosts whispering through the narrow alleys and empty lots. Every corner has a story. Every wall, a bullet scar. Every family, a loss they no longer talk about. The war for Tijuana was never just about drugs. It was about identity, about who controlled the heartbeat of a city that connected two worlds. The U.S. border, with its bright lights and steel fences, looks so close, yet for many here, it's another universe entirely. A promise they can see but never touch. For decades, Tijuana has been painted in two colors, red and green. Red for the blood spilled. Green for the money that caused it. But beneath those colors is gray, the quiet, invisible color of survival. Mothers who lost sons to the cartels now run small taco stands to survive. Children born during the height of the violence have grown up knowing gunfire better than fireworks. Journalists still walk to work every morning, not knowing if the stories they publish will be their last. In neighborhoods like Sanchez Taboada, Camino Verde, and Mariano Matamoros, life goes on, but not the same. People avoid certain streets after dark. They know which bars belong to which cartel. They know who to call when someone disappears, and it's not always the police. Tijuana has learned to live with its ghosts. The old Arellano-Félix name still echoes in hushed tones. El Chapo's legend still haunts the tunnels that run beneath the border. And the initials CJNG are now sprayed on walls where children once played football. For outsiders, the city looks alive, the nightlife, the music, the tourist crowds returning after the pandemic. But those who live here know better. The danger doesn't vanish. It adapts. The cartels don't disappear. They evolve. In 2023, Tijuana once again topped the list of the most violent cities in the world, with over 2,100 murders. Mexico News Daily, 2023. But the most chilling thing isn't the number of deaths, it's how normal it's all become. There's a certain numbness that comes after decades of bloodshed. A generation that no longer flinches at the sound of gunfire, that scrolls past headlines of bodies found on highways like it's just another weather report. The ghosts of Tijuana don't scream anymore. They whisper. In bars, in bus stops, in quiet conversations between people who've seen too much and learned to say too little. One journalist once described it best. Tijuana doesn't cry in public. It bleeds in silence. Yet, beneath that silence, something persists, a stubborn will to live. Because despite the fear, the city refuses to die. It rebuilds itself, one small act at a time, a mural painted on a broken wall, a song played on a street corner, a mother who still sets the dinner table for a son who never came home. You can see it in the eyes of people crossing the border every morning for work. They carry the weight of a city that refuses to surrender. You can hear it in the music blasting from the clubs downtown, where banda songs drown out the sound of police sirens. Life continues. Because in Tijuana, survival itself has become a form of rebellion. But there's one thing about ghosts, they never really leave. In the early hours of the morning, when the city sleeps, police radios still crackle with reports. A black SUV spotted in Zona Norte. Gunshots near La Mesa. Another body found on the outskirts. Different names. Different faces. But the story stays the same. As long as there's demand north of the border, there will be supply in the south. And as long as money moves, men will kill for it. That's the cruel equation that Tijuana has lived with for generations. A city caught in the middle of an empire it didn't build but can't escape. Yet, among all the blood and silence, one truth stands unshaken. The real victims were never just those who died. It's the ones who survived. The mothers who still wait by their doors. The children who grow up fearing the same streets their parents once ruled. The people who still love this city, even as it keeps breaking their hearts. Tijuana isn't just a battlefield. It's a mirror, showing the world what happens when greed, corruption, and poverty collide at the edge of civilization. The war for Tijuana wasn't won. It was inherited. From the Arellano-Félix brothers to El Chapo, from Sinaloa to CJNG, each left behind a piece of themselves in this city. A legacy written not in history books, but in blood. And as the sun rises over the border wall, the city wakes once more, tired, scarred, but still standing. Because that's what Tijuana does. It endures. It carries its ghosts, not as a curse, but as proof that even in hell, life finds a way to keep breathing. In the end, the cartels may come and go. The names will change. The wars will shift. But Tijuana remains. A city that burned twice, and still refused to turn to ash. The city glows under a thin layer of fog. Cars crawl along the border. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. The war for Tijuana has no victors. Only survivors. For more than 3 decades, this city has been the crossroads of empires, where greed meets desperation, where paradise meets hell. It began with men chasing power. It ended with families chasing ghosts. The Arellano-Félix brothers are gone now, dead, imprisoned, or forgotten. El Chapo, the man who once ruled like a myth, now sits behind concrete walls 1,000 miles away. El Mencho, the new phantom of Jalisco, remains unseen, a shadow that moves but never speaks. Different names. Different faces. The same story. Because in Mexico's underworld, there is no true ending, only silence between the storms. And Tijuana knows that silence better than anyone. You can still walk through the streets of Zona Norte, where the neon lights flicker over cracked pavement, and see people trying to forget. Street vendors selling tacos beside bullet-marked walls. Children laughing, unaware of the history buried beneath their feet. Somewhere, a mother lights a candle for a son who never came home. These are the real stories, not the headlines, not the legends, not the blood-soaked glory that filled news feeds for years. The real story of Tijuana is written in resilience. In the quiet strength of those who refused to leave, even when the world gave them every reason to run. In the teachers who kept showing up to classrooms when gunfire echoed outside. In the journalists who kept writing even as their names appeared on hit lists. In the everyday people who chose to rebuild instead of surrender. Because if there's one thing this city has proven, it's that even the darkest night can't last forever. But still, the shadows remain. Cartel banners still appear. Murders still happen. The cycle still turns. And that's the hardest truth to face. That for every name that falls, another rises. For every empire that crumbles, a new one waits. The faces may change, but the system, the hunger that fuels it, never does. Because this isn't just a Mexican problem. It's a global one. The drugs that move through Tijuana end up in cities thousands of miles away. The money that funds the cartels passes through banks with glass towers and spotless floors. And the demand, the endless demand, comes from the other side of the border. That's the part of the story no one wants to claim. The part that connects the chaos of Tijuana's streets to the comfort of suburban homes far away. Because every gram, every pill, every shipment, begins with a choice. And those choices built this empire of blood. Yet through all this darkness, Tijuana still breathes. It still sings. It still hopes. Hope, fragile, quiet, but unkillable. The kind of hope that lives in the sound of children playing soccer in alleyways, in the murals painted over bullet holes, in the prayers whispered at sunset. Tijuana's story isn't just about the war. It's about what survived it. It's about the people who stood on the edge of chaos and said, "Not yet. Not today. Not this city." And maybe that's why the ghosts haven't left. Because they're not here to haunt. They're here to remind. To remind us of what power can do. And what humanity must never forget. The bloody battle for Tijuana wasn't just the story of cartels. It was the story of survival, of a city that burned twice, and still refused to die. And as the sun rises over the border wall once again, the city wakes, tired, scarred, but defiant. Because even after all the blood, even after all the loss, Tijuana still stands. Before you go, if this story moved you, even for a moment, don't let it fade away when the screen goes dark. Every like, every comment, every share helps keep stories like this alive, and helps shine a light on the truths that too many people try to bury. The war for Tijuana isn't just history, it's a mirror of the world we live in right now. And by engaging with this story, you become part of that light, part of the reason these stories continue to be told. So, if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit that like button. It tells YouTube this story matters. Drop a comment below, tell me what part hit you the hardest, or what city you think we should uncover next. And subscribe, because the next story might just reveal the truth behind another war you've never heard about. We're building a community here, not just of viewers, but of witnesses. People who care enough to look deeper, to remember, and to never stop asking questions. This isn't just a video, it's part of a movement to document the untold. And it starts with you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.